Alright guys, Tim here. The next few lectures we will be covering the most common ways to write for orchestral forces within trailer music. So we'll be looking at strings, brass, choir and percussion. They'll all be linked together so that there's some sort of familiarity between them and you can see how all these examples will fit together. We will cover woodwinds in a separate lecture as they're rarely used in trailer music. So I have two sets of examples here representing the most common moods in trailer music. We've got uplifting and dark. And these examples are just going to show you a good way to build up a track with each section. Just bear in mind though that more often than not trailer music is darker than it is uplifting, but it will be good to show you how to write in both formats, particularly because uplifting has a more thematic style to it. Once we've gone through the uplifting in detail, we'll then just go into the dark one, just briefly looking over the same techniques and how they're applied. So let's give this first one a listen. So in most tracks that use an orchestra, strings usually have the biggest part to play. Whenever I'm writing a track, I usually use the strings for an intro and then I'll use them to build up into the midsection. Strings for me are they're split into two sections, so we've got longs and we've got shorts. Although it is not uncommon to have another section for FX. The string longs in the intro, they're just playing off the piano melody and the chords, building up to a cutoff point, which I will later add a transition into the midsection. So here is the string longs on their own. And then we've got the string shorts. And again, they're playing off the piano chords, except the first violins have, they're playing this neat little motif that we're going to repeat with slight variations throughout the piece. And then we stop them here when we've got that string long, what sound they called? So now that we've got the intro sorted, we can move on. The intro, what it's done is it's provided us with some really cool ideas that we can play with and develop throughout our piece. So now we're going to move on and take a look at the midsection. In the midsection, these shorts are going to take the bulk of the performance at the beginning, and we're going to keep that motif from the intro, and we're just going to play it throughout. We're also keeping the dynamics of this section down a bit more than we previously had them, because there's plenty of time to build dynamically. And if you think about the trailer itself, the beginning will almost always start off low in dynamics, it'll build up a bit, and then it will come back down after a point of interest. The midsection is where we get things moving on a bit, so we're going to focus on pacing the track more than building the dynamics. and the string ostinati are a really good way to achieve this. And after the first 4 bars, we're going to add a little bit of flavour with the string longs, so nothing over the top. It's just going to be something a little bit differently rhythmic to the string ostinati. And that's just something to back up the chords, again like I said, with a different sort of movement to the spiccato strings. So now that we've got about halfway through the midsection, we can start building up dynamically. So before I play this bit, just so you know, I've skipped about 4 bars here, so it probably would have been more or less the same sort of thing we had going on in the first half of the midsection. And then we're gonna finish off the midsection with this new bit here. So it's often good to change things up a little bit towards the end of the midsection. We need this difference to help us build and feel like the piece is actually going somewhere. So 2 things I've changed in this section is to first of all bring the long strings up an octave. Not only have I brought them up an octave, but I've given them something melodic that we can return to in the back end. And the other thing that I've done is I have changed the chord progression. So before, the chord progression went like this. So this new chord progression, we have actually heard it before at the end of the intro, it just wasn't as obvious. But now that we're building up with this new chord progression, it feels like our track has a lot more movement and it's really pushing towards the back end. The low strings, they're playing the bass notes, and the short strings are still doing their thing. And that is the end of our midsection, so let's move on to the final section of the piece. So the short strings are still doing the same thing, I've just pushed them up an octave and they're a bit more intense. You can always change the rhythm here or move some notes around, it doesn't always have to be the same, so long as we bear some relation to it before. And then the long strings, we have them playing the melody now, and the back end is a really good place to put in the melody. However, they don't stand out so much just yet. And I'm not too fussed about that because I know that I'm going to be having other sections like the brass playing the melody. We can have the strings sticking out with the melody a lot more in the second half of the back end. So I'll just play the melody for you again quickly. And if you remember, that was the melody we had right at the beginning of the piece with the piano. So I would likely do another 4 bars of the same thing, but with some sort of melodic variation. And then that will then bring us to the final part of the piece, well, the final part of the back end, where everything really comes out full force. So here's where all the ideas come together, just a lot more intense. The long strings are playing the melody, as I mentioned before, in octaves at the top of their register, so higher than they were playing it before. And again, the short strings are still doing the same thing, just with some slight variations, and they're a lot more intense, as you can tell by the colour. And obviously the lows are playing the bass notes. So the second half of this part is going to be the end. We really want to ramp this up, and a good start would be to bring back that second chord progression from earlier, if you remember from the midsection 2. Because it really does feel like a finishing progression there. I usually don't add crazy string sound effects and uplifting tracks. I like to save them for more darker, more experimental sound zone tracks. With that, we are done with the uplifting and we're going to move on to the dark one. So we'll just go through this one briefly, talking about the same sort of techniques that we used. So a couple of things to think about when you're writing for dark. Try and keep it ominous at the beginning, because that will give us a lot of room to build up. Think about the lower registers, how their movement can affect this, and how we can flesh out the chords similar to how we did with the uplifting version, which is what I'm going to show you now with the second half of the intro. So there's not a lot of movement going on there, it's just one chord per bar and we're just descending down. I've decided I'm going to leave the string shorts for the midsection. No real reason why, it just felt right to do so. So as I said, I'm bringing the shorts in the midsection of the piece. Again, it's a great place to get the movement really starting. So just by that, we can tell how this piece is going to go. We've already given ourselves enough ideas to play with. Right, let's move on to the midsection 2. So for the second half of the dark mode, we're still building up, adding intensity via the higher octaves and denser chords. I'm fine with not really having any string longs in the higher registers because I know what I want to do with the brass, so I'm happy with the strings just doing ostinato for the midsection. And it also gives us more room to play around with the back end. So as we did with the uplifting track, we're bringing back the same ideas, just a fair bit more intense. The high strings are now playing a super simple melody, and don't be afraid to go really simple with this. So all they are doing is and then I'll probably have them doing something similar for the next 4 bars, probably with, again, a melodic variation of some sort. The spiccato strings, however, whilst backing the chords and the rhythmic movement, also have a small motif of their own, developing throughout the piece to this moment. So here's the string longs on their own. And the string shorts. And then after 4 more bars, we come to the final half of the back end. So the same again, just more intense. Again, we're developing through both the string shorts and the string longs, both going up octaves and making the chords a lot thicker. We're also finalizing the piece with an extended chord progression, taking us through to the end of the track. I'll just show you that quickly with the short strings. So right at the end here, we're just holding on to that last chord, going between the chord itself and the sus version of that chord. I don't usually tend to add more chord progressions in dark style music because I like to build up in other ways, like instrumentation and sound design. And as shown in this example, extending the last chord in the progression to make room for like a riser or something. Just some very quick and basic mixing techniques I like to use on my strings. I like to boost the highs, especially in the short strings to give them some sort of decent bite. I like to use Altiverb for some roominess and an algorithmic reverb like Lexicon for a nice tail. OTT and a limiter onto the stereo output for volume and frequency boosts. So overall, find a good way to build the strings by thinking about the mood of the piece. Will your trick have an ostinato rhythm? Most likely yes, but it's not necessary. For example, this dark version doesn't actually need any of these string shorts. If you wanted, you could just have the string longs by themselves and we could build it up in other ways. Having strings in octaves towards the end of a track and chords in the beginning is a pretty solid way to go about writing for them. Don't feel limited to having the strings playing one thing at a time. They are the biggest section and they are the most versatile, so they can do pretty much anything, and you can have them doing longs, shorts, and FX like I said at the beginning. They're not as limited to sustains and spiccatos. They just happen to be the most commonly used and most effective. Remember, all these techniques, they're not mood or genre specific, and you don't actually need to use all of them. They're just a good starting point for building a solid track. That is all for strings, and I will see you on the next lecture for brass.